Power is not always the hand on the spotlight. Sometimes it is the name hidden beneath the invoice. At 10:30 on a pale winter morning, Manhattan looked rinsed in silver, with soft snow still resting along West 42nd Street and the glass towers throwing cold light over the avenue. 27 floors above the traffic, the upper windows of nearby office buildings reflected the city like polished steel, bright enough to make every private weakness feel public. Inside the Oraline Glass Conservatory, a $180 million Couture venue built above a restored Beaux-Arts arcade, the runway gleamed ivory beneath a vaulted ceiling of frosted glass. Simone Hartley arrived quietly. She wore a tailored oxblood coat, black gloves, minimal gold earrings, and the kind of calm that did not ask to be noticed because it had already survived being underestimated. Her skin held a warm, deep brown glow against the pale room, and when she stepped past the white orchids at the entrance, two editors from Mode Register turned to look before remembering not to stare. Warren Kingsley did not notice. His navy Italian suit had been pressed within an inch of perfection. His silver watch flashed each time he checked his phone, and his smile appeared only when a camera crossed his path. He measured the room like a man measuring applause. The guest list held 216 names, including fashion editors, private bankers, 2 legacy department store heirs, and 3 silent partners from a luxury investment group Warren had been courting for 11 months. To them, Simone was presented as his wife, elegant and useful, the softened edge of his reputation. To Warren, she had become an accessory from a previous season. He leaned close without looking at her and said, "Stay gracious." The words landed colder than the draft slipping through the glass corridor behind them. Outside, yellow taxis cut dark lines through the snowmelt, while far above Bryant Park, the city lights and office towers still burned against the late morning haze, as if New York refused to admit daylight had fully arrived. Simone noticed the details Warren never did. The altered seating chart, the missing name card, the assistant who avoided her eyes, the pale silk dress moving behind the press wall. Tess Arden emerged near the side entrance in cream satin, smiling with the practiced brightness of someone who believed attention was the same thing as importance. Her blonde hair had been shaped into soft waves, her lips held a careful gloss, and her hand rested lightly on Warren's sleeve for exactly 3 camera flashes too long. Simone counted them. Warren introduced Tess to a senior editor as the fresh face of the Kingsley-Oraline partnership, then guided her toward the front row, where Simone's seat should have been. The chair marked for Simone had been moved 7 feet back, beside a narrow aisle used by assistants carrying garment bags. It was not an accident. Maribel Shaw, Maison Oraline's operations director, stood near the backstage glass doors with a headset in one ear and worry pressed into the corners of her mouth. She recognized Simone in a way Warren never had, not as a decorative wife, but as the private guarantor behind a rescue structure filed under Hartley Advisory 5 years earlier. Simone had once saved the Maison's protected design library, its artisan payroll, and its digital fitting system through a layered facility no gossip columnist could understand. An Atelier IP continuity covenant, a Maison source escrow protocol, and a Couture pattern rights schedule buried inside a preferred equity arrangement. Warren only knew the room was beautiful. Simone knew who paid to keep its lights on. Then the first chimes sounded through the conservatory, low and expensive, and the automated glass shades softened the morning sun into a theatrical glow. Tess stood when Warren touched her elbow, not toward the audience, but toward the backstage corridor where models disappeared before reappearing as symbols. Simone watched the movement, the timing, the arrangement, and the small triumph in Tess's face. Something had been prepared. Warren smiled for the press line, his hand still hovering near Tess, as if he were presenting his future. Simone placed one gloved hand over the silver invitation in her lap and felt the raised Oraline crest beneath her fingers, smooth, cold, and almost weightless. She did not ask why. She already knew. The runway did not go dark. It brightened, slowly, until every polished surface in the Oraline Glass Conservatory reflected the morning like a verdict. At 10:47 a.m., the automated shades lifted 3 inches, allowing a blade of winter sun to cut across the ivory floor and catch the last traces of snow melting along West 42nd Street below. Beyond the glass, Manhattan's high-rise windows glittered in stacked rows, city lights still visible in the upper offices where bankers had arrived before dawn. Then Tess appeared. She stepped from the backstage corridor in the ruby couture dress, and for one full second the room became too quiet to be polite. The gown had been made for Simone Hartley's posture, Simone Hartley's proportions, Simone Hartley's story. Its black gold inner embroidery was inspired by the scholarship seal from the community college where she had first studied finance at 19. Tess wore it like decoration, never realizing it had been built from another woman's life. Warren laughed beneath the runway lights, his face warm for the cameras, his hand raised in a practiced half-wave, his expensive smile telling the room that nothing improper had happened. In the darker corner near the assistant aisle, 7 feet from the seat that should have carried her name, Simone sat still with her gloved hands folded over the silver invitation. He performed possession. She measured consequence. The host introduced Tess as a new symbol of American couture confidence, and Warren nodded as if he had purchased the sentence himself. 3 editors lifted their phones. 2 investors leaned forward. 1 stylist whispered Tess's name as though the dress had made her important. Simone noticed Maribel Shaw standing behind the glass backstage door, pale with recognition, one hand pressed against her headset. The mistake was now public. Warren turned slightly toward Simone, not enough to honor her, only enough to check whether she was behaving. His eyes carried the small arrogance of a man who believed silence meant surrender. Tess reached the center mark, lifted her chin, and turned beneath the skylight, letting the ruby fabric catch the cold sun until it burned against the cream walls. The applause came carefully at first, then louder, because wealthy rooms often clap before deciding whether something is decent. Simone did not move. Under the chair beside her, the altered seating card lay where an assistant had dropped it, its edge bent, her name printed in charcoal ink beneath a smaller line that read secondary placement. The only sound near her was the soft crack of the card stock when her thumb pressed through the Oraline crest. On stage, Warren leaned toward a Mode Ledger correspondent and said Tess brought new life to the Maison. In the corner, Simone opened her phone and read the message from her counsel at Hartley Advisory. Maison source escrow protocol remains enforceable. Couture pattern rights schedule confirms subject origin protection. Runway image revocation clause available upon notice. The words were not emotional. That made them cleaner. Outside, a sheet of melting snow slid from the conservatory roof and scattered against the lower glass with a delicate, icy hiss. Inside, Tess smiled wider, mistaking borrowed symbolism for victory. Warren accepted another camera angle, adjusting his cuff so the platinum links flashed beside the dress he had no right to present. Simone watched his reflection in the glass wall rather than his face. Reflections were more honest. Maribel crossed the backstage threshold at 10:52, stopped 3 paces from Simone, and whispered that the original fitting dossier had never been reassigned. Simone did not look surprised. She asked one question. Is the ledger intact? Maribel nodded once, the way professionals answer when panic is not useful. On the runway, Tess completed her final turn, and the hem of the ruby dress brushed a silver floor marker with Simone's initials still embedded in the production code. Warren rose for a standing ovation before anyone else did, forcing half the front row to follow his performance. He laughed under the lights. Simone sat in the cooler shadow beside the aisle, silent as a locked door. By 10:55, while applause echoed through the glass chamber and cameras chased Tess backstage, Simone had already authorized the first notice under the Atelier IP Continuity Covenant. She placed the damaged invitation back on the empty chair where her dignity had been reassigned. The torn crest curled upward like a small silver wound. Then her phone screen dimmed, and the purchase file opened. Simone rose at 10:58 a.m., not quickly, not dramatically, but with the quiet precision of someone closing a door that no one else had noticed was open. The applause was still rolling across the Oraline glass conservatory, bouncing off the vaulted glass ceiling while winter sun poured through the frosted panels and made every polished glass on the side tables shine too brightly. Outside, snowmelt ran in thin silver lines along West 42nd Street, and the upper floors of the neighboring towers still glittered with office lights against the pale morning haze. No one stopped her. Warren stood beneath the runway lights with Tess beside him, laughing for the photographers, his hand hovering near her elbow with the careless confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. In the cooler shadow near the assistant aisle, Simone slipped her black gloves from her fingers and laid them over the torn invitation, covering the Oraline crest as if closing the eyes of something that had already died. He smiled for the lenses. She prepared the consequence. Tess tilted her face toward the cameras while the ruby couture dress caught the sunlight and threw a red reflection across Warren's polished shoes. Two editors asked Warren whether this marked a new era for the Kingsley image, and he answered with the practiced warmth of a man who had rehearsed humility in a mirror. Simone turned away before the sentence ended, because some insults do not deserve the dignity of being heard twice. Her heels made no echo. Maribel Shaw met her beside the glass backstage corridor, where garment racks rolled past with silk covers, steam rising faintly from pressed fabric, and the scent of wool, cold metal, and expensive perfume hanging in the air. The corridor was only 12 feet wide, but it felt more honest than the main room. Maribel held out a slim slate-gray tablet displaying the design provenance ledger, the original fitting timestamp, and the subject origin marker attached to Simone's name from March 14th, 5 years earlier. The screen did not tremble. Simone looked once at the document, then at the runway reflection in the glass wall, where Warren was still laughing beneath the lights while she stood in the margin like a shadow with legal standing. The split between them was almost architectural, him in white gold brightness, performing ownership, her in the dim corridor, holding the proof. Maribel whispered that the production code had never been lawfully reassigned under the Couture pattern rights schedule. Simone nodded. Then preserve it. At 11:03, Simone authorized a preservation notice under the Atelier IP Continuity Covenant and locked the Maison's source escrow protocol into review status, freezing access to the digital pattern library, fitting history, runway image clearance, and client origin documentation. The only sound was the clean glass tap of her fingertip confirming the encrypted notice. Back in the conservatory, Warren's laughter rose again, wider now, encouraged by flashbulbs and borrowed applause. In the corridor, Simone removed her wedding ring for the first time in public, not as a spectacle, but as an administrative fact. She placed it inside a small white linen envelope Maribel had used for spare garment labels, sealed it flat, and wrote Warren's name across the front with a plain black pencil from the atelier desk. The graphite made a dry, final scrape against the paper. Warren caught up with her near the service elevator 2 minutes later, irritated but still smiling in case anyone was watching. He told her she was turning a beautiful morning into a problem, that Tess had only worn a dress, that Simone should understand brand strategy by now. Simone looked through the glass behind him, where the skyline shone cold above the avenue, and the city lights and the high towers looked like witnesses refusing to blink. She handed him the sealed linen envelope. Revenge is loud. This is consequence. Warren's smile thinned, but he did not open it. Simone stepped into the elevator alone, and as the doors met, the last thing she saw was his reflection splitting in half across the brushed steel. By 11:16 a.m., Simone had left the Oraline Glass Conservatory and crossed 3 blocks through thin winter wind to Hartley Advisory's private floor on West 39th Street, where the elevators opened into silence, walnut walls, and a view of Manhattan sharpened by snow. 24 stories below, delivery trucks crawled through gray slush, and the city's high windows still glowed in scattered grids, half daylight, half electricity, like a skyline unable to choose between exposure and disguise. She removed her oxblood coat, placed it over the back of a charcoal chair, and stood before a 12-foot conference screen already filled with Maison Oraline's ownership map. No one asked if she was all right. In the conservatory, Warren was still beneath the bright runway lights, smiling beside Tess as photographers called his name, while in the shadowed quiet of Hartley Advisory, Simone reviewed the system he had mistaken for decoration. He laughed for the press. She opened the structure. At the far end of the room, her senior counsel, Priya Maddox, displayed the first layer, $42. $7 million in preferred rescue equity, issued 5 years earlier through Hartley Advisory under a discretion-protected patron vehicle. The second layer showed a convertible artisan payroll facility that had kept 83 seamstresses, cutters, embroiderers, and pattern technicians employed during Maison Oraline's cash crisis. The third layer showed the hidden hinge Warren had never cared to read. The silent majority acquisition option, triggered by misuse of protected client origin Couture assets. Simone did not smile. At 11:21, Priya confirmed that the ruby gown's subject origin marker matched Simone's private fitting file, not Tess Arden's public styling brief. The design provenance ledger held the measurements, the inspiration notes, the scholarship seal reference, the embroidery approval, and the final runway use limitation. The Maison source escrow protocol had frozen the archive 34 seconds after Simone's authorization, blocking unauthorized access to digital pattern files, client history, and couture reproduction permissions. The room tightened into silence. Back at the conservatory, Warren lifted a champagne flute under the skylight, giving the cameras a relaxed grin as Tess leaned close enough to suggest possession. On the conference screen, Simone watched the runway feed in a small, muted window, his laughter trapped behind glass while her legal team prepared the notice that would make his smile expensive. He performed victory. She documented ownership. Priya placed a thick ivory purchase packet on the table, not a general contract, but the Maison control transfer instrument tied to the silent majority acquisition option, the couture pattern rights schedule, the runway image revocation clause, and a new ethical atelier governance mandate. Simone picked up the signing stylus. Its black lacquer body felt cool against her fingers, heavier than it looked, smooth as a decision made years before anyone mocked her in public. The only sound was the precise digital chime when her signature sealed the Maison control transfer instrument. At 11:28, Maison Oraline's board received formal notice that Hartley Advisory had activated its pre-negotiated controlling governance rights, subject to immediate review of all runway imagery, ambassador use, archival access, and client origin couture exploitation. Warren's PR team sent out 12 photographs of Tess in the ruby dress at 11:31. At 11:32, every image in the approved media portal entered restricted status under the runway image revocation clause. Simone watched the notification appear, then disappear into the compliance queue with no drama at all. Outside the windows, snow began again, soft at first, drifting between towers while sunlight struck the flakes and turned them briefly gold before they fell into the street. Inside, Simone opened a second folder labeled Hartley House, a name she had not used publicly since before Warren Kingsley made her surname feel like a costume. This was not revenge. It was restoration. At 11:39 a.m., while Warren Kingsley's press team was still trying to push the Tess Arden photographs through lifestyle outlets, Simone Hartley stood at the head of Hartley Advisory's conference table and opened the file bearing her maiden name. The snow outside had thickened, soft white threads falling between the glass towers over West 39th Street, while office lights burned across the skyline in pale rectangular rows, visible even in daylight because the storm had dimmed the city. Inside the private floor, the air smelled faintly of black coffee, warm paper, and the mineral chill carried in from the windows. Simone did not look triumphant. Across town, under the bright conservatory skylights, Warren laughed with a private banker from Madison Avenue, pretending the morning belonged to him. While in the quieter shadow of her conference room, Simone reviewed the future he had never thought she would build without him. He sold an image. She funded a door. The first Hartley House allocation was $18 million, divided into vocational scholarships, legal clinics for creative ownership, emergency income support, and apprenticeship placements for women who had been kept invisible inside luxury supply chains. Priya Maddox placed the Hartley House formation charter on the table beside the ethical atelier governance mandate and the artisan revenue participation schedule. None of the documents used soft language. Each page carried the precision of a woman who had learned that kindness without structure could be stolen, renamed, and worn by someone else under brighter lights. At 11:44, Maribel Shaw joined by encrypted video from the Maison Oraline back office, her headset gone, her voice lower now that the performance had moved out of her hands. She confirmed that 83 artisan profiles had been transferred into protection review, that the design provenance ledger had preserved Simone's ruby gown file, and that every commercial image of Tess in the dress had been flagged under the runway image revocation clause. Simone listened without interrupting. On the muted live feed in the corner of the screen, Warren still stood beneath the glass ceiling, smiling as Tess leaned toward a camera and touched the gown's front panel like ownership, could be performed by fingertips. In the shaded reflection of Hartley Advisory's window, Simone's face remained still, framed by snow and the cold geometry of Manhattan. He laughed under light. She signed in shadow. Priya slid forward a second instrument, the Hartley House Endowment Deed of Purpose, backed by a $62.5 million seed commitment from Simone's private holdings and future Maison Auraline licensing revenue. The document directed that every season of profit would fund women trained in couture construction, trademark literacy, financial negotiation, and design provenance protection. Simone picked up the same black lacquer signing stylus, but this time her hand paused for half a breath. The Maison had been reclamation. Hartley House was repair. The only sound was the soft seal of the stylus meeting glass as her signature fixed the endowment into motion. At 11:51, Maison Auraline's board received its second notice. No future collection could use a client origin narrative, private fitting archive, or artisan-derived motif without documented consent under the client narrative safeguard rider. 3 minutes later, the Kingsley Communications office asked why the photographs had stopped appearing on approved channels. At 11:56, a luxury media editor emailed Warren's assistant asking whether Tess had authorization to wear a subject origin couture piece tied to Simone Hartley. Warren did not answer at first. He was still in the light, still smiling, still unaware that the ground under the runway had shifted. Simone closed the Hartley House folder and placed it beside the damaged invitation she had brought from the conservatory. Its torn silver crest caught the gray daylight from the window and bent upward like a small piece of surrendered pride. She did not throw it away. She kept it as evidence that a public insult could become an institution. At 12:07 p.m., the first fracture appeared not in Warren Kingsley's voice, but on his assistant's phone. The snow outside the Auraline Glass Conservatory had turned heavier, whitening the edge of West 42nd Street, while the city's high office lights glowed through the storm like rows of watchful eyes. Inside, the winter sun had faded behind cloud cover, leaving the runway bright from artificial panels and the room suddenly less forgiving. Warren was still smiling. A senior editor from Mode Register stepped away from him without finishing her champagne. A private banker from Madison Avenue lowered his voice near the glass wall, and two luxury investors who had arrived at 10:18 now stood by the exit with their coats already over their arms. The issue was no longer a dress. It was governance risk, unauthorized asset use, and a public sign that Warren had sold access he did not control. The applause had ended. The questions had started. At Hartley Advisory, 24 floors above West 39th Street, Simone sat in the shaded conference room as snow softened the skyline beyond the windows and the city lights shimmered against the gray afternoon. She had removed the damaged invitation from the table and replaced it with a live compliance dashboard from Maison Auraline. Warren laughed under the runway lights, bright and polished for the thinning press line, while in the darker calm of her office, Simone watched each restricted image request fail in real time. He chased warmth. She held the switch. At 12:11, the Kingsley Communications office received notice that all Tess Arden runway images were under immediate usage suspension pending subject origin review. At 12:13, the luxury department store heir who had promised Warren a $90 million placement campaign requested confirmation that Maison Auraline still endorsed the Kingsley partnership. At 12:16, the answer came through the Ethical Atelier governance mandate. No endorsement could proceed while protected couture provenance remained under dispute. Warren's assistant stopped smiling first. Tess noticed second. Warren noticed only when the photographer from City Style Weekly lowered his camera and asked whether the ruby gown had been authorized for public brand use. Warren gave a soft laugh, the kind meant to make a serious question look small. It did not work. Across town, Simone leaned back in her chair, her expression unchanged, while Priya Maddox read the next notice aloud. Client narrative safeguard rider active. Runway image revocation clause active. Maison source escrow protocol sealed. Artisan revenue participation schedule pending board adoption. The legal terms crossed the room like sealed orders. No one raised their voice. In the conservatory, Warren stood beneath white gold lights with Tess at his side, his smile growing thinner as the press line shifted away from admiration and toward verification. In Simone's darker office, The snow tapped softly against the glass, and the compliance dashboard filled with red denials. He performed confidence. She audited damage. At 12:22, Tess tried to fix the mood by stepping closer to the cameras, but the ruby dress had become a question instead of a triumph. Her cream satin wrap slipped from her arm and fell against the floor marker, covering the production code that still carried Simone's initials beneath the runway polish. A junior publicist bent to pick it up, then froze when her tablet flashed a restricted use warning. The only sound was the thin crack of the plastic press credential when Warren's assistant folded it too hard between shaking fingers. By 12:29, 3 scheduled interviews had been canceled, 2 investor cars had been called to the curb, and 1 board member from Maison Auraline had stopped taking Warren's calls. Warren turned toward Maribel Shaw near the backstage corridor, expecting the old obedience of people who feared his money. Maribel gave him a professional nod and nothing else. Simone watched the muted feed for 7 seconds, then closed it. She did not need to see him understand. Outside Hartley Advisory, snow thickened between the towers, and the afternoon lights of Manhattan appeared colder than morning, sharper in every window. Inside, Simone opened the Hartley House staffing file and approved the first 20 apprenticeships for women from Queens, Newark, and the Bronx. Warren was losing access to a brand. Simone was building a door no one could take from them. At 12:46 p.m., Tess Arden stopped pretending the cameras still loved her. The snow outside the Auraline Glass Conservatory had become a white curtain over West 42nd Street, blurring the taxi lights below and turning the high-rise windows across the avenue into pale squares of electricity suspended in gray air. Inside, the runway panels kept shining with expensive discipline, but the room had changed temperature. The warmth had gone out of the applause, the polished glasses, and Warren Kingsley's smile. Tess felt it first in the silence around her. Warren still stood under the white gold lights, laughing lightly with a luxury investor who was already checking his driver's location. While in the darker calm of Hartley Advisory, Simone Hartley reviewed apprentice names beneath the soft flicker of Manhattan's stormlit skyline. He tried to hold the room. She had already moved the center. At 12:49, Tess followed Warren behind the glass backstage corridor, where garment covers hung like quiet witnesses and the scent of steamed wool mixed with cold air from the loading doors. She demanded to know why her photographs were being blocked, why Mode Register had pulled the live post, why 2 editors had suddenly addressed the dress as Mrs. Hartley's piece. Warren lowered his voice, not out of kindness, but because 3 assistants were within 15 feet. He told Tess it was a procedural issue. She heard weakness in the word. In Simone's conference room, Priya Maddox confirmed that the Artisan Revenue Participation Schedule had been accepted for emergency board review and that Maison Auraline's cutters, embroiderers, and pattern technicians would receive protected profit participation on all revived heritage designs. Simone signed the staffing authorization for Hartley House's first cohort, 20 women, for instructors, 2 legal fellows, and a $1.8 million training reserve. She did not look back at the muted runway feed until Maribel Shaw called again. Across town, Warren smiled beneath the conservatory lights as if his image could still outrun the notices, while Simone sat in the shadow of a storm-dimmed window, snow striking the glass like soft static. He managed perception. She secured people. At 12:57, Tess removed the cream satin wrap from her arms and placed it over a chair with more force than elegance. The ruby couture dress caught on the edge of a garment rack, and 1 black gold thread from the inner embroidery pulled loose near the hem. No one moved for a second. The only sound was the tiny rip of the protected embroidery thread as Tess stepped back too fast. Maribel's face tightened, not because the dress was ruined, but because the damage had made the provenance visible. Beneath the loosened seam, Simone's subject origin mark glimmered in dark metallic stitching. Warren saw it. Tess saw him see it. At Hartley Advisory, Maribel's message arrived with a close photograph, timestamped 12:58 p.m., attached to a preservation escalation notice under the design provenance ledger. Simone studied the image for 3 seconds and approved the escalation. No anger crossed her face. The board's emergency channel filled with notices. Client narrative safeguard rider elevated. Couture pattern rights schedule verified. Ethical atelier governance mandate in force. Tess Arden ambassador eligibility suspended pending review. Warren tried to call Simone at 1:02. She let the phone glow silently beside the Hartley House folder until the screen went dark. In the conservatory, Tess turned on him with a brittle smile and asked whether he had ever owned any part of the story he sold her. Warren had no clean answer. His laugh came out small beneath the lights. Simone, in the darker room across the city, signed the final apprenticeship release, and the stylist touched glass with a soft, finished click. Outside both buildings, snow kept falling, erasing footprints faster than pride could make them. 4 years later, at 9:10 a.m. on a clear February morning, Maison Auraline reopened its New York flagship on Madison Avenue with 3 floors of glass, limestone, and quiet authority. Snow from the night before still rested along the edges of East 63rd Street, but the sky had sharpened into a pale blue, and the high towers beyond Central Park carried city lights in their upper windows like the last traces of an old winter dream. The flagship did not feel like a retail floor. It felt like a court of craftsmanship, filled with hand-finished jackets, heritage sketches, ivory work tables, and 27 young women from Hartley House standing beside their first completed couture pieces. Simone Hartley arrived without needing an introduction. She wore a black high-neck gown cut with severe elegance, a narrow gold cuff, and no visible sign of anyone else's name on her body. Her beauty had deepened into something less decorative and more difficult to dismiss. She looked like the final signature on a room that had once tried to erase her. At the front window, a plaque listed the new Maison principles: client narrative safeguard rider, artisan revenue participation schedule, design provenance ledger, and ethical atelier governance mandate. None of them were slogans. They were locks. Across town, Warren Kingsley appeared at a luxury media breakfast on Fifth Avenue, standing under warm ceiling lights in another perfect navy suit, laughing too loudly beside men who no longer returned his calls as quickly as before. In the shaded private salon above Maison Auraline, Simone reviewed final scholarship numbers with pre-ematics while Snowlight moved across the table in clean white bars. He smiled beneath rented attention. She signed permanent access. At 9:24, Hartley House announced a $74 million expansion, funding apprenticeship housing, creative ownership clinics, and emergency legal support for women whose designs had been borrowed, renamed, or hidden behind more powerful people. The announcement carried no attack on Warren, no mention of Tess Arden, no dramatic retelling of the ruby dress. It simply stated what had been built. Maribel Shaw stood beside Simone with silver in her hair now, holding the first Hartley House graduate certificate in a cream portfolio stamped with the Maison Auraline seal. The only sound was the firm press of the seal closing over the graduate's name. Downstairs, reporters photographed the students, not as background labor, but as designers with credits, equity participation, and protected authorship under the Couture Attribution Safeguard Framework. At 9:37, a black sedan stopped across Madison Avenue, and Warren stepped out. He looked older in daylight. His face still carried the architecture of wealth, but the easy arrogance had thinned, leaving something more exposed beneath the tailoring. He paused at the window display, where the restored ruby gown stood behind glass, not on a mannequin shaped like Tess, but on a neutral couture form with a small card reading, "Private Origin Piece, Hartley Collection, Subject Protected." He stared at it for a long time. The city moved behind him. Taxis hissed through melted snow, pedestrians passed with coffee cups, and morning light flashed against office windows high above the avenue. Inside the Maison, Simone watched him through the second-floor glass without flinching. Warren lifted one hand in a restrained greeting, almost a question. Simone did not hurry toward him. She turned back to the scholarship table, signed the final Hartley House access approval, and placed the pen down beside the ledger. The click was soft, exact, and complete. For years, Warren had believed the room belonged to whoever stood brightest beneath the light. That morning, under clean winter sun, he finally understood the darker truth. Light could flatter a person, but structure decided who remained. At 9:52 a.m., Warren Kingsley was escorted into the second-floor private salon of Maison Auraline, not through the front entrance where reporters waited, but through a side corridor lined with framed sketches from the restored Hartley collection. Snowlight poured through the tall Madison Avenue windows, clean and almost gentle, while the city below moved through slush, coffee steam, taxi horns, and the glitter of office towers still holding small squares of electric light against the winter morning. Simone Hartley stood beside the long ivory table where the final acquisition record had been displayed for the board, the Maison control transfer instrument bearing her signature from 4 years earlier, the silent majority acquisition option fully executed, the ethical atelier governance mandate now embedded into every Maison season. Warren looked at the papers before he looked at her. The truth was simple enough to wound without shouting. He had let Tess Arden wear Simone's couture dress on stage, and Simone had bought Maison Oraline, the fashion house that made it, controlled its design library, protected its artisans, reclaimed its runway rights, and turned his public insult into an institution carrying her maiden name. Downstairs, photographers captured Hartley House graduates beside their first credited pieces, while upstairs Warren stood under soft gallery lighting, smiling weakly out of habit, as if charm might still open a door that law had already closed. In the brighter room beyond the glass wall, guests applauded Simone's students. In the quiet shadow of the salon, Simone watched Warren finally understand that he had mistaken access for ownership. He asked if they could speak privately. Simone allowed it. His voice had lost the smooth command it once carried at openings, dinners, and press lines. Now it moved carefully, like a man walking through a room full of things he could no longer afford to break. He said he had been arrogant, that he had confused image with loyalty, that he had treated her like a name beside his rather than the mind behind so much of what he had built. Simone listened without rescuing him from the silence. Warren glanced toward the restored ruby gown behind glass, its subject origin marker preserved, its provenance card clear, its story finally returned to the woman it belonged to. He said Tess had lost 2 representation offers and disappeared from couture circles within a year, not because Simone attacked her, but because attention without substance had nowhere to stand once the borrowed light went out. Simone did not smile at that. She had not built Hartley House to celebrate another woman's emptiness. She had built it so fewer women would have their work renamed by people standing closer to the camera. Warren placed his hand near the edge of the acquisition record but did not touch it. The only sound was the soft slide of the protective glass case, closing over the signed Maison ledger. He asked whether forgiveness was still possible. Simone looked past him, through the tall window, at the city shining cold and alive above the snow. She told him forgiveness had already happened, quietly, long before he found the courage to ask for it. But forgiveness was not a doorway back into her life, her company, her name, or her peace. Warren's eyes lowered. For the first time, he looked less like a billionaire denied and more like a man seeing the cost of treating dignity as decoration. Simone walked him to the salon door herself, not cruelly, not warmly, but with the composed courtesy of someone who no longer needed anger to prove the damage had been real. Downstairs, a young Hartley House designer adjusted the sleeve of a black wool coat she had made under her own label, and Simone paused just long enough to watch the girl sign her name on the garment card. That was the victory. Not the ruined campaign, not the frozen images, not the man who came back too late, but the quiet transfer of power from those who borrowed stories to those who finally owned them. Warren turned once at the threshold and asked if there was any part of them left to recover. Simone met his eyes, calm as winter sunlight on glass, and gave him the only answer that still belonged to him. You lost access. Some people think revenge is the moment the powerful fall, but real consequence is quieter than that. It is the moment a woman stops asking to be seen and builds a world where no one can erase her again. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.